guys. So, I'm Tyler. If you want to find me on Facebook, I'm Tyler Peterson. I'm a junior here at the zoo. I'm a meteorology and a philosophy major. I'm not officially a philosophy major. I've got to tell the zoo about that. As a junior, that's kind of a problem. I decided to add the philosophy major over the summer. And so I scheduled for classes tomorrow. So I should probably get on that, talking to the zoo about, I have 3 semesters left and I'm scheduling for one of them tomorrow. They should probably know that I'm adding a major. Alright, so now I'm going to give you 3 pieces of information and then I'm going to ask you a question. So it's Bread Co. Emos is amazing. And I went to Rockwood Summit High School. Now where am I from? Amen. Alright, so I gave my freshman year, March 2017, I gave an E3 talk here. I never thought I'd give another one again. But it was on Saints and Miracles. And the entire time, I did this. The entire time. And I didn't realize that until a week after I gave the talk when I watched the video online. I was like, oh no. Oh no. So, if you see me doing that, please do that as well when you're in your chair. So if everybody's doing this the entire time, I'll get the message. All right, so I've got two good stories here about a guy, but I'm not going to tell you who they're about just yet. Your job is to figure out who it is. But in your head, please, that's what rhetorical statements are about. Gosh. All right, so this guy, both stories are about the same guy, by the way. This guy lived in a communist country, and the government always had listening devices because they were spying on him. He knew this, of course. If he wanted to mislead the government about something, he would have his conversations closer to where he knew the listening devices were, and he would speak louder so that they would know what he was saying. But if he wanted something to be confidential, he would go to the wilderness, which is hard because he was in a city at the time. So to get there, he would go in 2 cars. Which is kind of a problem because how can you be in the same place at once, or 2 places at the same time? But what would actually happen is he would switch cars halfway through. So why would he do that? It's because the communists, the government, they would always have a car in the alley next to his house, and that car, whenever he would leave the house, that car would follow him. So much so often that he nicknamed it his guardian angel, because it never seemed to leave him. All right, so how he would get away to go to the wilderness is he would have his driver swerve through traffic, kind of like Crazy Taxi, but the car couldn't jump over other cars, I think. And then the car would round a corner, like real fast and stuff, and then this guy would jump out of the car to a waiting car. He'd get in that car, and then both cars would split, and they'd go in opposite directions, very much confusing the spy. And so they'd get away and go to wherever he wanted to go and talk in private. So the second story starts like this. In countries where the government was communist, the only way an organization could exist is if the government picked out its leaders. For this story, we'll make up a fake one, and we'll call it Delta Airlines. So there was a job opening pretty high up in Delta Airlines. The highest ranking guy in Delta Airlines gave the government a list of 10 people. The government offhand rejected those 10 people and asked for more names because they wanted Delta Airlines to have worse leadership than they already had. So this guy from Delta Airlines gave the name Karol Wojtyła, and the government accepted Karol because he was 38 and they thought they could control him. LOL. Well, it turns out Karol Wojtyła was the Delta Airline guy's first choice. But he knew, this Delta Airline guy, knew that the government would deny his first choices, so he made Karol 11th on his list just to fool them. Also, this job at Delta Airlines wasn't actually a job at Delta Airlines. It was actually to be a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, and 20 years after this happened, Karol Wojtyła became Pope John Paul II, and he pretty much took down communism in Europe. Sounds like the communists needed better hiring managers. All right, so now we're going to kind of move on past these little stories to talk about some themes of John Paul II's life, because he was amazing. Is my favorite saint by like a billion, and just an amazing human being. So the one main point that he always did was he always kept levity and humor in his life, and he never got too caught up in his status or what people thought of him. He didn't take himself too seriously. One little story about this is in the Vatican, they have like these little gardens. They're called the Papal Gardens because the Pope is like the leader of that area, so they're his. And so one day he talked to the gardener, and he wanted to shake the gardener's hands. However, the gardener had a bunch of dirt on his hands. So the only way to get his hands clean were Pope John Paul II took his hands, rubbed it all over his white cassock, and when the gardener was like, "What are you doing? That's terrible. I'm not going to wipe my hands on your cassock." John Paul II's like, "Hey, I don't care. I don't do the laundry." Going with this, he had a true freedom in his life with Christ, so he lived like it. He didn't stay bottled up. He didn't let fears take him down, and he let Christ transform him into who he was created to be. An example of this is that he loved to ski. He skied his entire time. He was like in seminary when he was a priest for his 20 years of being a priest. The entire time he was a bishop, and then even when he became pope. So he was pope for 27 years. Of those years, 15 of them he was skiing. That all stopped when he was 73. And it wasn't because he was old. He would have still kept skiing. However, he broke his hip while getting out of the shower. And his doctor said, "You probably shouldn't ski anymore." And so that was the end of his skiing days. When he was a cardinal, so before he was a pope, he was told, "It is unbecoming of a cardinal to ski." Then he said, "It's unbecoming of a cardinal to ski badly." And then probably the more serious thing is he fiercely defended the important things in life. In particular, he saw the inherent God-given dignity in each person and how Christ is truly in each one of us. When people would talk to him, they would always say that he made them feel like they were the only person in the room. That no matter what was going on, who was entering, who was leaving, no matter what was going on in his life, what crisis was hitting the church then, what meeting he was about to be late to, whatever, he made sure that he gave all of his attention to them instead of having his attention wander. And he affirmed their dignity in that way, showing them that if Christ is right in front of, if Christ is in every person and he's talking to a person, that means he's talking to Christ in some way. And so that's probably the most important thing you can do, is talking to Christ. So he always allowed his attention to stay on the people in front of him. And because he saw Christ in everyone, he was a ferocious opponent to anyone who would infringe on true human rights and human dignity. And I've read a couple books about JP2, but I've come to realize that I want to recognize Christ in everyone too, just like him. It also ties in quite a bit to my own life, because I never quite felt accepted by many people until a year or two ago. JP2 sensed the great hunger that all people have to be known and to be loved. So before I talk about my own little story, I have two pictures of me when I was a little kid. There's one picture of me, and then there's another at a family reunion. I think I was in first grade, maybe second grade, right there. All right, so my story kind of starts in first grade. I had a best friend. Let's call him Bob. I had some other friends that I enjoyed as well, but Bob was the OG. In second grade, time has passed. This guy, we'll call Jim, moved down the street from myself and Bob. And he essentially became friends with Bob, and then basically ended Bob and I's friendship. So this next part that I'm about to say would be totally fitting in a final fight scene of a movie. So here's the scene. There are three second graders riding their Razor scooters. So for you kids back home, these are what Razor scooters look like. They're basically prehistoric birds. So they're riding their Razor scooters when suddenly one of the characters briefly disappears while the hero isn't paying attention. The audience can see the character coming around for a big hit on the hero, and they try and warn the hero. But unfortunately, the fourth wall exists, and the hero remains clueless, and he gets knocked off his scooter. However, instead of falling into a large pit to his death, I just scraped up my knee a little bit, but I did lose my best friend that day. So pretty much while I was in elementary school, pretty much every weekend, and then during the school year, and then quite often during the summer, I would ask my parents if I could play with my friends and stuff. And often they would say yes, not all the time, but a lot of the time. And then I would go search through the Utah Valley Buzz Book, that was my elementary school, and I would find the kid's home phone number, and I would call them, and I would always reach the parents because kids don't answer the phone because that's scary, and I would make my request to their parents. Quite often, they would say no because their kid was busy. I'm sure most of it was they actually were busy, and they were probably going to a soccer game or their grandparents or whatever. But even at the time, when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old, I sensed that some of that was probably because the kids just didn't want to play with me. They didn't want to be friends with me. And I'm sure I got called sometimes during elementary school to play, like by someone else calling me. However, I don't specifically remember any. It was the vast majority of calls to play were made by me to other people. And sort of that kind of rejection stuck with me hardcore. During middle school and high school, I developed several groups of friends because I was a human being, and you do that, especially when you're in lots of different organizations like sports and band and school and whatever. But I was always very different than the people that I was friends with. And so other than maybe one or two people, I never really developed any like super close connections with anyone. And that even carried on to my first semester here at Mizzou. I was pretty lonely. I had no real deep connections here, no real friends here yet. And I was separated from the few good friends that I had back home. I knew my best friends in my entire life would eventually come from Newman, so I threw myself at all the Newman events that I could, all of them that existed, Welcome Week, E3, Awakenings, all the stuff, even though I was introverted and was pretty uncomfortable. Eventually, though, I did make a lot of amazing friends. It just didn't happen that semester. So, JP2 loved people, young people, that is. And in the biz, we call that a rough transition. As bishop, he would take college students out on camping trips, and he would just be with them. And he would form them into saintly people. Imagine like Bishop McKnight coming out here and just camping with like a group of 5 of us for like a week out in the middle of nowhere. And these people, these that were college students then, as decades passed, they became the leaders of the Polish Catholic Church as the lay people. They held very high spots, important spots as evangelizers. I think some of them are now starting to get like causes for canonization getting going. They're very holy people because they had an encounter with what would eventually be a great saint. And part of that encounter was just because he invested in people. Like those kids, they probably never had been invested in by someone. But someone, John Paul II, or Bishop Wojtyla at the time, he saw Christ in everybody. And so he invested very deeply in people. And so that investment, that encounter that he had with them, was an encounter with Christ in them. And so he brought them to understand who Jesus was through those camping trips. And he created World Youth Day when he was Pope. And he gave such a priority to young people, even when he was in his 80s and Parkinson's disease was making him lose control of his muscles and killing him. And the young people adored him. And even now, we here at Mizzou are directly affected by that love between the young people and John Paul II because of Focus. So apparently Curtis Martin, who is the founder of Focus, had a visit with John Paul II probably like 20 or 30 years ago. And he told him about this idea for a missionary organization. And then John Paul II essentially blessed it and said, "Be soldiers." So Focus partially comes from this blessing by John Paul II. And now we are directly affected by that, by the missionaries, by mission trips we go on, by how that affects campus ministry here. We're directly affected by John Paul II through like 2 or 3 degrees of separation. It's pretty close. So the love JP2 had for people our age directly affects us now in many ways, and it affected me a ton personally too. It seems like John Paul II has his fingerprints all over my life. So after my freshman year of college here, I made a pretty rash last-minute decision. During finals week in May, Christine Long, she asked me, hey, we have a spot open for the Holy Land mission trip that's in 2 months. Do you want to go? And I was like, that sounds amazing. And I decided to go, which was crazy because I had to fundraise $4,000 in like a month and a half, which was hard. And even though I didn't quite make that goal, I took a pretty substantial hit, that trip was life-changing. And I'm so grateful that I went on it. Once I got back to campus, so the trip happened in the last half of July, the last 2 weeks. Once I got back to campus, I was asked by Taylor Sedgwick and Blake Gorman to be on this new peer ministry team to basically make sure that people were invited to things at Newman, that they didn't slip through the cracks of Newman because they just didn't get contacted, so that they could be invited into a deeper relationship with Christ. And so that ministry, built upon my trip to the Holy Land and the graces that I received from it, that was just a couple weeks prior, and it created a blazing fire in my heart for other people. And I know this is super cheesy, and it pained me to write this, but through the unanswered calls during my childhood, God was preparing for me for a greater call later in my life, like now, to help others know and accept their personhood. And even though I didn't know it, JP2's blessing of focus in some ways helped make that focus mission trip happen. And so I see JP2 all around me, and all the things that I do, it's like he has a fingerprint on it. So my whole life, I had always felt pretty alone. But after that trip, I wanted, with everything that I had, to make sure other people did not feel the same. So anytime I was at E3 or Mass or Awakenings or whatever, I made sure to find the people who looked lonely. And it's not very hard because those people usually are by themselves and they look like lost puppy dogs. It's very easy to tell the people who don't know anybody there. And I would find those people and I'd strike up a conversation with them. I would ask them a couple of really basic questions that we have as college students. What's your name? What's your major? Where are you from? Why'd you choose Mizzou? Why'd you choose your major? Basically, really simple stuff like that we all have in common. I think that it's probably the easiest time in anybody's life to talk to someone that you don't know because you have so many just canned questions that are so easy to ask that they lead directly into conversation. And even though those questions seem a little bit cheesy, conversation from my experiences almost always flowed through that. JP2 is helping me to recognize Christ in every person. If Christ is in every person and a person looks lonely, that means Christ is lonely. Why wouldn't I go and assuage that loneliness? Why wouldn't I go visit with Jesus in each person? And so I'm pretty well connected here with Newman, friends with a lot of people. I know a lot of people in this room. But it's still really awkward for me to strike up a conversation with someone who probably 10 seconds prior I didn't even know existed. Yet, imagine how awkward it is for that person to walk into a room of people that they don't know. Imagine how you felt when you first came to Newman. Maybe you knew a couple people, but probably a lot of you, like myself, didn't really know anybody. And so you're walking into E3 or something, and you don't really know everybody, and there's 40, 50, 60 people in there, all talking to each other, and you're like, hi. But you just kind of stand there awkwardly because you don't know anybody, you're not going to butt into their conversations or something. And so it feels terrible, it's lonely. And it's super awkward, of course. But through finding these people, I can talk to them and I can take the awkwardness away from them and place it on myself. I basically, by doing this, anybody who's talking to someone who looks lonely, who doesn't know anybody there, is throwing them a lifeline. It's like if someone talked to me when I was first here at Welcome Week stuff, like Blake did, because Blake is a very talkative guy. He's very, very good at his job, and now he's a salesman, so good for him. But by talking, if someone came to me, I would have felt so relieved because it's like, I feel so weird just standing here, not knowing anybody, but everybody else knows each other. But if someone would have come up to me, I'd have just felt super relieved. And that lifeline being thrown is an act of mercy, and it's an act of love. We should all try to find those people in our lives who need to be loved, who need company, who need support. And it doesn't have to be someone who's like new here. Like anybody can feel lonely or unloved, no matter how many people they know. They need us as well. And we should be those things, the support, the love, the company. We should be those things for those people as well. Because Jesus needed those things when he was undergoing his passion and when he was on the cross. And yet most of his friends ran away because of fear. Let us not run away from awkward situations because of fear. JP2 said, "There is no place for selfishness and no place for fear. Do not be afraid then when love makes demands. Do not be afraid when love requires sacrifice." So like for me, when I'm like noticing someone around the room that like doesn't know anybody, it's a sacrifice for me to leave my friends who I'm talking to and talk to them. I would rather talk to my friends normally. However, that's like more superficial. And I realize what I actually want is for everybody to feel loved. And so actually I do want to talk to them because the talking to them makes them feel a little bit more loved. And it does take a little bit of bravery, courage to talk to someone new because it's always awkward. So we have to fight against fear, and we have to fight against that selfishness to just like want to sit with my own friends and be comfortable. We're not made for comfortability. We're not made for mediocrity. We're made for greatness. And so we have to get outside of ourselves sometimes and talk to new people, talk to people who look like they're lonely, who feel like maybe they're having a terrible day, something like that. We can tell that a lot of times. Like you can have a sense that that's happening. All right. So like I said earlier, JP2 fiercely defended the important things. And for him, the oppression of the dignity of human rights was the most pressing issue at the time. He grew up under the Nazi reign. He was 19 when the Nazis invaded Poland. And then eventually communist dictatorships of Poland and the Soviet Union. And he saw how important it was for free will to be respected and for people to have the opportunity to freely worship God. All right, so in case you need a refresher, here is Poland. So we got France, we got Germany, we got England, we got Russia up there. I think that's Ukraine. That's definitely Poland, that's Italy. So there's Poland. That's where JP2 grew up, that's where he was born, that's where most of his life happened, except for 27 years, and it happened somewhere down there. So there's Poland. Once he was elected Pope in October of 1978, he made plans to go back to his beloved homeland, Poland, in 1979, so like 8 months later or so. He wanted to go for 2 days in May to commemorate the feast of St. Stanislaus. So when I heard this story, I was like, who the heck is St. Stanislaus? Like, I think there's a church in St. Louis called St. Stanislaus that was in the news like 15 years ago when I was a little kid, but I know nothing about him. So what I learned was that St. Stanislaus was a bishop in Poland in the 1000s, like the 11th century, the 1000s, and the king of his part of Poland hated him because he denounced the king for his cruelty and his immorality and just being terrible. So one day during Mass, the king came in, he went up to the altar while the bishop was celebrating Mass, and he killed St. Stanislaus. So St. Stan became the principal patron of Poland, and he became a hero of the people, and most importantly, he became a symbol of the long Polish struggle against oppressive governments. Most of Polish history has been them being taken over by Russia or like Lithuania or Prussia and eventually Germany. Like most of their history has been them being ruled by other people. And so that's a big deal for them to have someone as a symbol of hope for them. So how this ties into John Paul II is 1979 was the 900th anniversary of St. Stanislaus' death and is the 1000th anniversary of Poland becoming a Christian country. So it was a big year. And the communists, who they had different governments, but they're all basically controlled by Russia, they knew that this was going to be a massive patriotic festival regardless, just because it was a big year. Much less with the beloved hometown boy coming back for it as well. So instead of him, JP2, coming back for the feast day of St. Stanislaus, his birthday into heaven, they offered him a deal to come back for 9 days later in the year. JP2 said deal. And the communists didn't know that, but actually his later visit happened during Pentecost. And Pentecost is the birthday of the church, when the Holy Spirit came down upon the apostles in the upper room. So they didn't know that, of course, because they were atheists. And this agreement started a chain of events that led to the destruction of the USSR and communism in that entire part of the world. The communists didn't realize, of course, that his trip was at Pentecost, but the Polish people, who 90% of them were Catholic, didn't let the symbolism of missing one birthday into heaven for the birthday of the entire church, they didn't let that symbolism pass them. So JP2 went all around Poland, and he told the people about their dignity, about how they were being oppressed. He told them about how people have a natural longing for God, and that the atheistic regime was brutally shutting that down. He celebrated masses for gigantic crowds of hundreds of thousands of people, 800,000, 1 million people in one place for mass. And he also remembered his roots as being a college chaplain, and he celebrated smaller masses for college students during his trip. He met with government leaders to negotiate for the rights of the people, as well as for greater operating space for the church to serve the poor. So at the beginning of his trip, he got into Warsaw, which is the largest city and the capital of Poland, and he was able to celebrate Mass there. And there were 800,000 people at this Mass. And so he had this homily, and it was a super powerful homily. At one point, apparently, he said something during his homily that gave him a 14-minute standing ovation in the middle of his homily. So here's like a little snippet of that. To Poland, the church brought Christ, who is the key to understanding the great and fundamental reality that is man. For man cannot be fully understood without Christ, or rather, man is incapable of understanding himself fully without Christ. He cannot understand who he is, nor what his true dignity is, nor what his vocation is, nor what his final end is. He cannot understand any of this without Christ. Therefore, Christ cannot be kept out of the history of man in any part of the globe, at any longitude or latitude of geography. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man. JP2 is such an inspiration to me because he truly understood what it meant to be a Catholic Christian, how to live a fulfilling life, how to live a heroic life, how to live a fun life, and live a life for others. And he used the immense gifts given to him, his crazy intellect, his crazy memory, his gift for poetry, for philosophy, for speaking, for leading people, along with the gift given to him of the papacy that he could leverage for the masses, the multitudes of people across the world to bring them to Christ. And he was immensely quotable, as you've kind of figured out. And he has a ton of amazing stories, a lot which I could not tell, unfortunately, because of time. But I feel like it would be really proper to leave with one last quote, which I think perfectly encapsulates what he was about. Although I have lived through much darkness, I have seen enough evidence to be unshakably convinced that no difficulty, no fear is so great that it can completely suffocate the hope that springs eternal in the hearts of the young. Do not let that hope die. Stake your lives on it. St. John Paul II. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.